And thank you to everyone who is joining us tonight. And thank you, Peter Goodman, for agreeing to be with us. Peter has had a colorful and exciting career as a globe-trotting correspondent. In the great tradition of many OPC members, he started out after college as a freelancer. He was with the Japan Times and other papers. He reported from places like Manila and Jakarta and Cambodia, and proudly relays an anecdote about getting kicked out of East Timor in 1992. So he obviously raised as much dust and got on the wrong side of as many officials as he could, also in the proud tradition of OPC members. But he wanted a full-time gig with some media company to backstop him. So in 1997, he went to the Washington Post, and he served 5 years for the Post in Shanghai. And then he, in 2007, he went to the New York Times, where he was a national economic reporter, just in time to write about the Great Recession. And then he decided to go to a digital upstart, International Business Times, where he was global editor-in-chief for a few years. And I skipped that he worked for the Huffington Post for a few years in between there, overseeing business and technology coverage. And then back to the New York Times, where he is today. He was in London until very recently. He's just moved back to New York, and he's their global economic correspondent. So welcome, Peter. Davos Man was coined by a political scientist named Sam Huntington. And he used it to refer to a class of wealthy attendees of the World Economic Forum, which everybody knows is that annual conclave to the Swiss Alps with CEOs and NGOs and heads of state. And anybody who wants to be known as anybody goes, as well as many journalists. But he uses Davos Man as a metaphor to describe the people who were enriched by globalization and people who are effectively stateless, who have interests and wealth that flow across borders, estates and yachts sprinkled across continents, arsenals of lobbyists and accountants straddling jurisdictions, eliminating loyalty to any particular nation. So it's not so subtle. It's not a complimentary description. It's really quite derisive, in fact. And he blames him, Davos Man they're all men. I guess women haven't been in power long enough that they're included in his book, but I suppose soon there will be some Davos women. But he blames him for wealth inequality, national deficits, the lack of government resources to deal with social problems, as well as many of the deaths caused by COVID, the rise of right-wing populist movements worldwide, and threats to get democratic governance. So these are some pretty sweeping conclusions. So Peter, let's dive in. I'd like to know what inspired you to write this book.
Well, first of all, let me just say thanks to you, Paula, for doing this, and thanks, Patty, for arranging this. As a former OPC board member, it's a real thrill to be doing this event. What inspired me to write this book? I was living in London, as you noted, and was spending a lot of time writing about Brexit, writing about Trump's trade war and the permutations globally, and about the rise of extreme right-wing movements across Europe and around the globe, from Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and closer to my home then, Salvini and other parts of the extreme right in Italy, even Sweden, this bastion of social democracy, where the Sweden Democrats, while I was there, emerged from the wilderness, this party forged in the neo-Nazi movement to become a mainstream political party. And in each of these instances, the kind of conventional wisdom explanation of what was going on was a backlash to something that had happened recently. It was, immigration. I mean, Trump was coming in not just as a backlash to immigration, but as a rebuke to China. The backlash to immigration was certainly part of what was animating Brexit, which was this nativist response to all sorts of changes in Britain, ditto Italy, France, Germany, Sweden, and so on. And the pattern that seemed very clear to me as I dug not even that deeply into each one of these cases was that there were longer term forces that had happened so steadily but gradually that they were almost invisible, that in every case were really crucial. And that was the subject of my book, which is the systematic bottom up transfer of wealth, from all of us to a handful of billionaires who can employ lobbyists and tax accountants and compliant think tank researchers, and can cultivate access journalists to insinuate into our political discourse this idea that when we organize our economies around returning wealth to people who already have most of it, we'll all somehow magically benefit, something that has in reality happened 0 times. And the result of this was to weaken governments, to diminish healthcare, education, assistance for housing, public infrastructure. And then the last straw typically was some usually influx of immigrants who some opportunistic political apparatchik could then point to as the problem for a very superficial problem for very real problems. And this was the template we'd seen again and again. And I was already starting to put together this book when the pandemic happens. And for a moment, I felt like, one of these people who had a Cold War history all ready to go as the Berlin Wall comes down. And I set it aside for a couple of weeks until I, quickly realized that my thesis was in fact being strengthened, and the role of inequality, the consequences of so few people monopolizing the bounty of global capitalism, that was being exposed and in fact intensified by the pandemic. And so then I felt like it was kind of an emergency to write the book.